Now let's go ahead and move on to our spring position preview. We're going to be talking about the defensive line today. Talked about the O-line last week. Defensive line this past season was a real concern for Georgia as the games went on. I really think that Auburn game sparked a lot of controversy for the defensive line. But this year the tables have turned because you bring back Nazir, Stackhouse, Warren Brinson, Mykel Williams, Connor. If you had to give this position a grade just based off the names that you see, what would you grade them?
I would give it a B. And I think if Georgia's going to win a national championship by the end of the season, it's going to have to be an A. Moving Mykel Williams to that jack, more of a natural edge rusher position, I think is going to be big for unlocking him and what he's going to be able to do. Getting back Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse, in my mind, two NFL-capable defensive linemen, I think is significant. But it's actually the names that we didn't necessarily see on that list that I think Georgia needs to make a big jump moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what Stackhouse and Warren Brinson are at this point. It's their fifth year in the program. They've played a lot of snaps. I don't know how much room for growth there is between the two of them there. It's guys like Christian Miller, who's entering his third year in the program, Jordan Hall, a former five-star prospect. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, I would include there as well, though obviously he's a potential starter, and I think he's someone who could benefit a lot from Mykel Williams' move. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins needs to stay healthy this year. And if him, Christian Miller, and Jordan Hall make big leaps and give Georgia, I think, something similar to a 2021 defensive line, I think that's maybe how you go about getting this position group to an A. And so, yes, Mykel Williams could be a very productive player for Georgia on the edge. You saw that in the game against Florida State where they used him differently than they had been in years past. But if this Georgia defensive line is going to reach its ceiling, which I don't think as high as the 2021 team is, but I think there's a lot of talent in that room, it's going to need guys like Christian Miller and Jordan Hall to take big steps forward.
Yeah, Mykel Williams was a guy who had a lot of hype around him as a freshman. I didn't feel like we saw the best of Mykel this past season until the very end, but he's going to have to be that captain of the defensive line this year. What would you like to see out of Mykel?
Yeah, I think the big thing is just playing him in a spot that is more natural for him. I think anyone that followed his recruitment and sort of understands this Georgia defense knows he's always playing a little bit out of position. He's just a more natural 4-3 defensive end. And they were sort of using him in a 3-4 defensive end, five technique type of role. And it's not a coincidence in my mind that you saw him play a little bit more out on that edge as a true, 7 or 9 technique. And you saw him in that game against Florida State really become a more disruptive force. And Georgia, I think, has also maybe got to be willing to let him pin his ears back and attack the quarterback more. Obviously, they want to have disciplined rush lanes. But Georgia has not been a very big sack-heavy team. And with the change in defensive coordinator from Dan Lanning to Glenn Schumann, one of the things I think we've seen now is that they're just not as aggressive defensively as they were under Dan Lanning as they are under Glenn Schumann. And so I wonder if you're moving him into sort of that jack position, which is sort of a hybrid outside linebacker defensive end spot, is that maybe how you best go about unleashing Mykel Williams? Because from a raw talent standpoint, he is as talented as anyone out there on this Georgia team. Led Georgia in sacks as a freshman. How do you go about getting the best out of Mykel Williams is a very important question that I think Glenn Schumann is going to have to ultimately answer if this Georgia defensive line is to reach its ceiling.
So we showed the projected starters on that first slide, but we have another one with some of the guys that could end up rotating in. Like you mentioned, guys like Jordan Big Baby Hall, Christian Miller, Jamal Jarrett, and then the transfer from South Carolina. Who is the most interesting name on this list to you?
I think for me, it's Christian Miller. He's a guy that made some flash plays at the end of last season. Georgia Tech, Alabama ultimately missed that game against Florida State in the Orange Bowl, but a guy who entering his third year in the program is a little bit more experienced than, say, someone like Jordan Hall or Xavier McLeod. I think he's a guy that can be a disruptive player in the middle of that defensive line, give them something a little bit different. And so for me, I think that's the guy who this spring and really this whole offseason, I'm interested in seeing, okay, what kind of strides does he make as a player? I'm not saying he's ultimately going to be the next version of Jalen Carter. I don't believe there is someone of that caliber on this defensive line. But if Christian Miller can make strides and emerge as a disruptive player and help also, I think, spell guys like Warren Brinson and Naz Stackhouse, I think that's going to go a long way in this Georgia defensive line ultimately reaching their ceiling.
And we had a lot of people return to the defensive line from last season, but what's going to make the 2024 defensive line drastically different?
For me, it's those young guys in that middle tier realizing their potential. You throw Gabe Harris on there. He's a guy that bounced between outside linebacker and defensive end. I think if he finds a home there at defensive end, that's a good thing for Georgia. Jamal Jarrett, year 2, he was hyped as a Jordan Davis type player. Does he make strides to do that? Because we didn't see him do that in year 1. They also signed quite a bit of talent in the 2024 recruiting cycle. What is someone like Joseph Jonah-Ajonye or a Jordan Thomas able to give you as a freshman? They're obviously not going to be starters, but what are they able to give you in terms of depth so that you're not as reliant on someone like a Stackhouse or Warren Brinson on a down-by-down basis? Again, I think one of the more telling stats with last year's defensive line. Through 12 games, so this was going into the Alabama game, Nazir Stackhouse had played more snaps in 12 games than Jordan Davis had in 15 games. And with what we've seen with this Georgia defensive line over the years, the deeper it is, the better it just happens to be because you're able to rotate more. And so if Georgia's able to develop quality depth behind those guys at the top, I think that's going to go a long way in this group reaching its ceiling.